Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be working on finishing, or at least getting the rest of this particular geometry node stack working correctly. To do that, we need to get the fades working correctly. We've already got a factor, or a list of numbers from 0 to 1 that represents the curve itself. So what we need to do is confine that list and modify it to get it to work the way we need it to, which is to say to fade off at the ends to get this particular, no, not properties, modifier, yeah, properties, modifier stack, to get this particular curve modifier to work correctly. So I'll just recap quickly what we did before. We offset it using a geometry nodes editor, and we changed it so that it would introduce random ripples and artifacts to sort of give the indication that this is a real chord, real power chord, with the little kinks and ripples that they often have, changing the ripple amplitude. Yeah, so the thing is, we don't want it to happen at the ends because we want the ends to plug into something. So if we look at the viewer node under spreadsheet, and then you click down here, viewer node, it usually drops you into evaluated. The viewer node is what this thing is here. So I have to plug in the geometry that I'm looking at, I want to look at, and the numbers associated with that geometry. So this would be the value. It interprets whatever you plug it into. So if it's plugged into a curve or if it's plugged into a mesh, it'll interpret those things. So knowing that, we can now see the fade from 0 to 13. Since we have a curve resolution rather, that is 14, and you can see that I can increase or decrease that. So it's sampling each number, and it's giving it a value of between 1 and 0 in a fall off, essentially. So what we want to do is we want to factor that fall off in such a way that it looks different and can be controlled differently. So we're going to add in some map nodes, map ranges. I'm going to add in 2. And they are going to be, I'm going to name them. This one would be start, and end. Of course, we're going to use these to map a variable fade into the ends of this number list. The idea is similar to the gate in that, or the multiply gate that we added in that. Oh, that would be a math node, wouldn't it? I'm adding another math node, and I'm setting it to minimum. So we're going to plug the results from both of these into the minimum node. We're also going to sample the minimum node. I'm going to leave the factor off. We're going to plug these 2 in here. So I just plugged the output from the minimum node, or the math node set to minimum, into the value for the viewer. So we're obviously seeing 1 because that's the minimum. So now we're going to take the factor and we're going to plug it into the value for start, and we're going to plug it into the value for end. I'm going to clean up the node a little bit just because it's easier to see. Sometimes it's easier to see what's going on instead of having this like spaghetti nest of nodes. And we're going to take, just to develop this particular node set, we're going to use a value node. We'll plug it in later. It's whatever, you know, some people do it this way, some don't. And we're going to double that. So the first one should be the sharp, and we're going to plug the sharp into 2 max. See those there better. Yeah, there we are. So these map ranges have a 2 max and 2 min. And they also have a from min and from max. So they're very similar to a color ramp. A color ramp takes a factor, which is to say a list of numbers representing usually a list between, like a floating point list of numbers between 0 and 1. And it takes that and it turns it into something else. So it's a little bit like the 2min, 2max, essentially. I suppose you can definitely use the map range to replace the color ramp. The color ramp is more artistically accessible, I suppose. So, but we're going to be using the map range for now because we want very precise numbers. And the sharp, we're going to plug it into 2minimum. Again, we're going to clean up the nodes a little bit. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. Oh, that's a little too clean, isn't it? All right. And then the we're going to just name this for the sake of it. Otherwise, never remember what it is. And the clip, we're going to call this clip. Clip. This is going to get plugged into the from minimum and the from maximum. And then we're going to do something here. We're going to invert one of these. Yeah, so we're going to take the map range, and instead of the default 0 to 0, like these defaults 0 to 1, 0 to 1, we're going to invert the last part here, just to flip the range around. We're going to call this invert. And then we're just going to plug this into value and then the result into from max, like so. And that should be it for this particular set. Now let's set this to something, 1. Set this to something, 1. And we'll see if something comes out. Oh, we have to set these numbers here. Yeah, this one is to 0. There we are. Everything's in order, I think. We're getting numbers. Factor goes into the values. Just double checking because these map ranges can be confusing sometimes. To minimum, invert. Yeah, it looks accurate. So I'm going to change the clip. Oh, the clip was way too high. There we go. So we're seeing something now. So what we're seeing now, of course, is a range of numbers with a fade to 0 at the ends, which is exactly what we want. And essentially, we've faded and compressed the one side on the start, and then we've reversed the effect for the other side. So we flipped the factor around and then compressed it again. The numbers, they go over 1, which isn't useful because we're using it as a gate. So we're just going to click clamp on our minimum. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, clamp doesn't really work on the values coming out of the map range. It seems to only work on the input values, but not on the output values, or the other way around. I'm not sure. But regardless, we have to use a clamp on the minimum math node here. So now we have a fade for both sides. And if we change this, it clips or extends the range of zeros at both ends. And this one will change the fade length. So we can make the fade softer, more gradual, or we can make it stand off a little bit from the ends. So now what we're going to do is just put those into our node group here. And we're going to call them the appropriate names so we know what they are. So this one is sharpness and clipping. So let's go into our group. And the first one is sharp. It would be, I don't know, it would be masking, mask sharp, I suppose. And fall off sharp, that's more descriptive. And fall off sharpness. And the second one will be and fall off clipping. And just get rid of these. All right. Doesn't do anything yet because these values, they're not even plugged in. So what we need to do, we'll just set it to something so it actually does something. There. What we need to do is we need to plug them into our gates to affect the clipping amount. So it's pretty simple because we already have a number plugged into the gate, and this number is offset amplitude. So we're just going to change the amplitude with a math node to indicate that it will be gated with our value here, our output. Just plug that in. And we're going to, before we do anything with the noodles, we're going to make sure this worked. So let's change the amplitude to something really crazy. And let's look at the sharpness fall off. Now, one thing about sharpness fall off is, oh, it does actually cap. Okay, so let's just unplug. We're just double checking to make sure this works. Plug this in back. Yep, so the ends are very far away. And then we're going to plug this back in. Plug this in. And now the ends are attached, which is really nice. And we can set the sharpness. So I don't know if we can, I don't know if it's going to show up here. Yeah, so the sharpness, you can almost see it working its way up the, yeah, in chunks, essentially. So if we set it to something like this, and then we set this down so the fade is lower, it helps to describe the node too. Like there's something here called tooltip. So once we know what these settings do, this one, what happens is the fall off is sharper the higher the value is. So and the clipping, the lower the value is, the less clipping. Yeah. Oh. So something else we can do is we can set a minimum and maximum here. It's not always, the problem is that setting a maximum, it's like, well, okay, so the clipping is dependent on how many vertices you have in the scene. So your curve resolution, let's say we'll take it up to 50. And the amount of clipping is going to have to be dependent on, no, actually that's right, the clipping isn't like that. Clipping is basically a value from 1 to 0. So we could just change this from 1 to 0. Minimum value would be 0, and the maximum would be 1. So now goes to 1, goes to 0. Perfect. This one, though, is related to the number of polygons in this, the number of vertices in the spline. We'll set the clipping all the way to 0. And it has to reach a very high number to fade the entire line. What we can do is something about that later on, but at the moment, we now have a way to control the ends. But something interesting happens when you, this is perfect. This is great for this particular shape or profile. But if I was to take a different profile, let's say I'm going to copy this, because this is just a round profile, and I'm going to call it something I can remember, outliner. This would be flat profile. And let's change it a little bit. I'm just going to add some more detail. I'm essentially making a kind of a square chord. I'm just going to scale individual origins, scales the handles based off of their own origin, sort of makes them sharper. I'm going to subdivide all of these ones again. Subdivide and scale these two by the x, except for change it back to median points. And I'm going to just scale by y. It doesn't have the desired effect. Just gonna move it a little bit. Anyway, it doesn't look very, what we could do, let's recalculate handles. Oh yeah, there we go. Nope. A, W, recalculate handles. Move these in a bit. Move these in a bit. It would be barely noticeable. Change this to individual origins. And we'll just mess around with this profile until it's good. Okay, so, can do a lot more work on the profile, obviously. So let's make this profile, I need another one here. Properties. Profile flat. Okay, so some chords do have this like double or even triple stacked chord in the piece. The problem is that you need a way to, I don't know if you can see both ends there, you need a way to make sure the ends are exactly where you want them to be. So you have, like, let's say a plug modeled, you want to put the plug on the end, it needs to be rotated correctly. But there's no way to do that right now. You could probably go in here and then sort of, let's change the tilt. I guess you could do that. That seems to be working. But we can also do it in the geometry nodes modifier. So yeah, this does work to change the tilt of the chord, and it's more accessible. Especially with the way that I'm sampling it right now. Yeah, because if you were to sample this, let's say I was to use, instead of resampling the curve here, if I was to take the curve to mesh, this one here, I'll just show you for example, and then I was to just put this in here, and then I was to add another one, mesh to curve, like that. So theoretically, you should not be able to change the tilt. Yeah, so you can't change the tilt on this because what's happened is that I've destroyed any tilt information that was on this curve before by sampling it to a mesh and then back to a curve. One way of getting a more granular curve is to do that, because what happens is when you sample a curve to a mesh, it adds more points along the line. But that's unnecessary if you use resample curve. Just keep it all a curve. So I will, I had something for rotating ends, but that's not necessary using this system. We're going to do it anyway, just because this is a method to learn geometry nodes. So this is definitely one way to do it, is to take the actual curve and twist the ends like this. You don't have a lot of control this way though over where the chord twists, because you'll see the whole chord twisting like this. It's pretty cool, but I mean, you could add another, let's say we add another piece here and move this down like this. Just change this to median. And then you could take this and you could change its tilt, and that would just change the end. But it is a lot of effort to do that if you want to limit the effect to where the effect is faded generally. So we're just going to delete this. So what we'll do instead is we'll use a geometry nodes modifier stack to, or geometry nodes to change the tilt or the tilt of the chord at the ends. This is not confusing at all. Okay, so this would be, I'm going to add this into a frame. Nodes, join a new frame. And I'm going to call this, this would be end fades. Yeah, something like that. Just so that it's easier to see what's going on. All right. So now we want to twist the ends. Well, we're going to need a value node for that first. Let's add a value node. It's not necessary for the node compilation, but this is generally my workflow for designing nodes. And we want to, the fade right here is actually going to work. It's going to work quite well, except it's the wrong way around. If you'll notice, the fade, let me change this to too high. It fades from 0 to 1. The problem is that we want the effect to fade from 1 to 0, because this is going to be a twist effect that will only affect the inverse of what the other effect is affecting and be linked together, if that makes sense. So map range again, and we're going to basically use this as another invert. So again, just going to invert. When you downsize it like this, the top value is the value. So if you were to just take, actually what we'll do instead is we'll pull out the start, plug it in there, and then we will duplicate this and we'll pull out the end result, plug it in there. So now what we want is the values won't, they will be added together, because the highest value will be clamped to 1 anyway. You don't need to take the minimum values. So we're going to add a math node. We're going to add these two together. So what we should end up with is an inverse of this particular fade you can see in the viewer here once I plug it in. And yeah, we got an inverse, which is awesome. All right, so now we have an inverse. Let's have it affect a twist modifier. So, or a twist effect. I'll just move these over because now we have our gate. So I want it to modify not both at the same time. I want each twist to be separate. So we're going to have two values so we can see them on the screen, essentially. Twist 1 and 2. And we're going to have a curve tilt. It should be in here somewhere. Tilt. Here we are. That's the wrong one. There it is, set curve tilt. Okay, so you want to do that before it turns into a mesh. And don't think it matters whether you do it before or after the handles. So now this tilt, the set curve tilt. There we are. Yeah, so it'll set the entire curve tilt. You don't want it to do that. You want it to just set a certain amount. Set that to 0. So now we're going to add, well, math node. Actually, we got one here. We're going to just add these two values together. And we're going to put them into curve tilt just to demonstrate. Okay, that's good. It's amplifying them, obviously, but sure. So now we have these two ranges. Actually, we don't need this add modifier. Let's add this first range. It's going to be just the one end. So this first range would be added directly in here. And the second range would be added in here. Okay, so but there's no way to control these now because they're just gates. These are tilt gates, essentially. So we're going to add in another math node. We're going to make this multiply. And these are gates. No, these aren't gates. These are fades. These are amounts. The multiply is a gate. And now we're going to add in our values again. So the value goes into the bottom of the gate. And of course, we'll just double that. And we will make another one like so. There we go. So now we should see the ability to actually tilt one side. Let's see if we can see them both at the same time. There we go. Yep, you can tilt one side and then you can tilt the other side, which is super cool. Okay, that was pretty easy. Okay, that covers that section, and we will have to cover the rest of this in the next episode. So stay tuned for that, and until then, keep practicing. I'll see you then.